Yeah, and it's the reality of your business. You know, you as a person, you might have a persona that you want to project to the world, but if you invite people into your home, they get to really see what you're like. And it's the same for your business. You've got to be able to have that space that embodies your brand.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Bradley Hartman. So back in March of 2024, I was very excited when I went to the mailbox. There's something small that comes in the mail that I get excited about every single year, and it's a magazine. That's right. I still get it in print. I'm still a big believer in magazines. Fast Company is one of them. I also read Wired cover to cover. And if you've gotten away from like print magazines and are only reading them digitally, I know it's a thing, and maybe I'm just old and cranky and I like paper because it comes from a tree. I'm telling you, it's worth $30. Just try it. $30 a year will get you these magazines delivered to your door. Nonetheless, Fast Company arrives, and it is the most innovative company's edition. And there's always sorts of ideas, and there are many from construction and industrial design and things like that that are always relevant to us. And I stumbled across one of the winners for the most innovative companies in 2024, and the headline read, "How Gensler devised an algorithm to help convert offices into residential spaces." The subhead read, "Architect Stephen Paynter and his team came up with a solution that dramatically expedites the tedious assessment process." So I'm not going to leave you hanging. The punchline is I reached out to Stephen Paynter, and he is the guest on the show. But this is what I read that got me so excited. In 2020, during the early days of the pandemic, architect Stephen Paynter and his team at Gensler realized some of their clients might want to turn now empty office buildings into residential spaces. Paynter knew from experience that many of these structures could be good candidates for conversion, but he also knew that determining which ones would work involved an evaluation process that was time-intensive and expensive. So he and his team came up with a shortcut, an algorithm that expedites the assessment process. It cut down the process from 3 to 4 months to 2 days. Gensler's algorithm evaluates roughly 150 aspects of a building's layout and design, such as core to window depth and a number of elevators and parking spots and public data, broker websites, and subscription services. The worst office buildings make the best residential projects, Paynter says. Apartments are kind of like cellular rooms: bathroom, kitchen, bedrooms. Turns out, 70s offices made for cubicles are kind of cellular too. As Paynter says, the goal isn't just to bring people back to the office, it's more about bringing people back downtown. If you are not familiar with Gensler, Gensler is a global architecture, design, and planning firm with 57 offices and more than 6,000 professionals across the Americas, Europe, Greater China, and APME, which I should have done more research, should mean Asia Pacific something. You can Google APME and figure out. Anyway, what I'm to gather here is they're global. That's the main thing. They're a giant global architecture, design, and planning firm. And Mr. Stephen Paynter is the global building transformation and adaptive reuse leader at Gensler. Adaptive reuse is what we're going to be talking about here, which is taking unoccupied office buildings and converting them into residential buildings. Widely regarded as an industry thought leader, Stephen focuses on unlocking the value of Class B and C buildings by converting them to residential, shaping the future of cities and the design of post-pandemic office buildings. Stephen studied at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, got 2 hyphens in there, sounds very British, Northumbria University, and the University of Liverpool, where he received an advanced diploma in the professional practice of architecture. Now, despite Steven being under the weather, he persevered and made time for us. So you, my friends, are in for a treat. We talk about adaptive reuse and the opportunity that is out there to convert these office buildings that are either old and decrepit and places you do not want to work into vibrant residential spaces. We also talk about an office, I want to say of the future, but it's really the present, and how Gensler is leading the way to create current office spaces that help people do what they need to do and do it as best they can. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Mr. Steven Paynter of Gensler. As always, thank you for listening. Mr. Steven Paynter, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Now, I appreciate you making time. The Fast Company magazine, their annual edition of the most innovative companies, is something I always look forward to, just to learn new things and see what smart people are doing to really push the world forward. And what you have done and what Gensler has done immediately caught my attention. That's when I reached out and I said, I want to learn more about this. If I can, the story that I'm really curious about up front is, maybe can you take me to that moment where, I'm assuming, you can correct me if it's wrong, so it's during the pandemic, so a lot of things are changing. Working from home we're all kind of grappling with that. And you and your team, you have the idea to, what if we had an algorithm that had, I don't know, 100, 150 different criteria, and we could weight them to figure out in the future how we might be able to convert office space to residential, giving affordability crisis we've got and all sorts of other things where we're looking for more residential downtown. Can you take me back to that moment where you had the idea and then carried that to the rest of their team? And how did that early process go?
Yeah, so interestingly, we actually started this in 2019. And if you remember back pre-pandemic, people were talking about an upcoming recession. So whenever something like that happens, especially in the construction and design industry, we go out to our clients and say, okay, if the recession is coming, what do you need help with? And we got a lot of different answers and feedback, but we're always trying to gear our services and what we're providing to what our clients actually want. And that seems obvious, but it's amazing how many times people forget that. So the clients that came back to us said, well, we have Class B and C office buildings that are built in the 70s. They're hitting that 50-year mark, and they're kind of obsolete. They are going to need a huge amount of investment in them to replace all the systems and upgrade them to be office, or they're going to require a huge amount of investment to change them into something else, into residential, into hospitality, whatever. So we started thinking about it then, and it was this idea that there's got to be an easy way to determine the best use of an existing building. Is it best to keep it office? Is it best to change it? Whatever. But the process for doing it back then was to take the building, spend a lot of time designing, rendering, doing floor plans, and then 3 or 4 months, quite a lot of the client's money to do that. And then you go back to them with a design, which everyone is pretty and it's beautiful. And they put the stats into a spreadsheet. And if that spreadsheet goes green, they do the project. If it goes red, they don't. And it's as simple as that. The actual kind of design part of it, is only a small bit. So we wanted to be able to get from what do we do with this building to, is it financially viable, a lot more quickly, and do that because our clients needed us to do that, because they couldn't keep spending 3 months, 6 months on every single building they look at. Fast forward a little bit to the pandemic, and it became absolutely critical as more offices started to become more vacant. More clients had to do 5 buildings or 10 buildings, and cities needed to do the entire downtown to figure out what was happening. So you couldn't spend 6 months per building. If you got 100 to do, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. So that's where the algorithm really started to take shape. It was this idea that you should be able to take the data from a building and crunch the numbers on it and get a result that is not perfect. It still needs a design, it still needs all of that, but it's good enough for you to say, this is what we should focus our energy on. This building or the building down the street, we should focus on it being office, or we should focus on it being something else, residential or whatever. So that started to become the idea, and it became an algorithm basically because I was sat crunching the numbers on an office building that we were working on, and you do it in Excel. Basically, you sit there and you're like, this is the floor area. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the stats of the building. You do some design and you update the stats. And we were just doing that over and over again. Well, in the modern world, if you do something more than 2 or 3 times, there's a better way of doing it. So I started to then get a bit smarter about, okay, well, maybe this sheet can calculate stuff itself. And then the further you go down that line, the more it just becomes an algorithm. It becomes something that can do a lot more work itself, crunch a lot more data a lot more quickly than you can as a designer sat there. But in essence, what it does is it takes the data from the office building, breaks that down into numbers. It takes the data from the perfect residential building. So what would you build if you could build the dream building? Turns that into data, and then it compares the two. And that the gap between what your office building can achieve and what the ideal residential building is, and the ideal location and so on, that gap obviously has a value to it. Mm-hmm. The further apart it is, the more challenging it's going to be to convert the building. The closer it is, the easier it's going to be. Now, we weight those gaps depending on how much they're going to cost, or how much additional cost that is, or how much value it's going to bring to the end resident. Is it in a good area? Well, you can't. No amount of money that you invest in the project can change the area it's in. So that's a value piece. Do you have to replace the entire facade, or can you maintain it? That's a cost piece. Mm-hmm. But both at the end of the day affect the viability of the project. And that's what this allows us to do, is judge that gap for cost and value, and then assign it a ranking, essentially, to help clients either move forward with a project or say, actually, this is so far away from being viable, we're just going to park it and we're going to go look at the next building instead.
What I've read is you found in general about 30% of current office buildings are in the discussion for conversion. Did that number surprise you? Did that kind of confirm what you were already thinking, or any sort of surprises along the way as you've arrived at that number?
Yeah, it's a number that's kind of evolved over time as we've looked at more and more buildings, and we've done over 1,500 projects now in this. So it goes up and down a little bit as we add new cities and new buildings, but it hovers around the 30%. And that kind of confirmed what we expected, honestly, because we kept going to clients and say, have you considered residential? And they said, yeah, we did it for this other building. It didn't work, so we never want to look at it again. And most of the clients we spoke to said that. So the assumption then had to be that most of the buildings don't work. What was key was then, if some work, and we knew that some worked because people have been doing these conversion projects since the 50s, how do you find the ones that work without going through the pain of the other 70% that don't?
Right. Yeah.
You become very unpopular with clients if you keep spending their money on projects that don't go anywhere.
I can imagine.
So that speed and finding the 30% is the key to what we developed.
As you've been alongside and advising, designing, working with construction companies that have gone through that process, I think from a high level, this is what I was thinking when you saw all these empty places downtown, and then you see just wherever you are in North America, and I'm less knowledgeable about the globe, just the overall affordability crisis we've got. It's like, when I was young, I lived downtown Chicago and it was wonderful. I'm not sure I could still do that today. I know I couldn't do that today. So I started thinking, hey, all these places are gone. I started talking to some of my construction friends about, what do you guys think about that? Obviously unaware of what you were working on. As you've been alongside during that construction phase, what sort of insights have you had about that actual construction process, the actual conversion, once you've identified it's one of the 30%, and work has begun on maybe things that have gone smoother, or maybe some other hiccups that were maybe less anticipated?
Yeah, for me, the interesting thing, and I've done repositioning, all my career. The interesting thing is, every time you go into an existing building, there's something strange about it. So we've kind of developed this process of going back to the original permit drawings, and in most cities you can go find the archive permit drawings, and sitting down with them and understanding what that original engineer or that original architect was trying to do with the project. Because after the building was built, there's layers of 50 years worth of stuff that's been added and changed and messed with, and it kind of hides that original intent. So you can go back to those archive drawings and you can say, okay, well, this is how the building was built in the first place. This is the information that you cannot see when you walk into the building because that original structure is hidden behind drywall. That original approach to the systems has been changed and whatever over time. So you can go back to that original clarity. What it then takes is architects and contractors and even clients that are willing to take the time to understand that. Buildings built in the 70s were built in a completely different way than we build them now. And if you go from one building to the building across the street or a different city, the approach to construction would probably be different. You can't then come and take a modern lens and just be like, this is what we're going to do. Mm-hmm. You have to be sensitive to it. And that kind of embodied knowledge of like, how do people build something in the 70s? You have to know that. And on the teams on the construction sites have to know that because they have to learn to intuitively expect something and not just be like, well, it's probably steel and concrete because that's how we build it now. Because, it probably isn't. And behind that wall is probably not what you would expect it to be in the modern age. So you have to do that. And then you have to be sensitive to all of the peculiarities. Like we're doing a project right now, which is cast in place concrete frame. And then all of the floors are these kind of hollow core precast decks that are about 30 feet long. It's weird. And if you cut a hole in one of them, they just, are going to collapse. So I can't just be like, okay, put the bathrooms anywhere and core drill wherever you want.
Right.
Because the building will fall apart. So you then have to start to take that into account when you're designing and when you have, we get the contractors in early. We start having them scan the slabs to see where the panels are joined and this kind of thing. But you have to be thinking about that every step of the way. You can't just assume it's going to be fine like it would in ground up construction. You've got to assume if I take down that wall, there's a problem. Mm-hmm. And my job as the architect is to predict that problem by looking at the archive drawings and figuring it out. And then the job on site is to take that into account and be aware that these buildings are all individual and all slightly different. And they're going to take a different approach every single time.
Yeah, that just, I think, reinforces something that we intuitively know in that, in general in life, the more you understand the history of your profession, of your craft, the better suited you will be to understand why something is happening today. And sometimes, I'm sure this has never happened to you, but you're on a job site, you're talking to someone and they see something they don't understand and they just assume, well, this person who did this is an idiot, obviously. And however, what we're doing today in 50 years from now, someone is going to be looking at what we're doing, which we believe to be very smart today and might be, as far as we know, smart. And they're going to look at this and say, why on earth would anyone ever do this? But there was somebody 50 years ago, probably really smart, working really hard, thinking it through, who did it for a reason. So that's a really interesting story.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly why our buildings are all full of asbestos, right? 50 years ago, it was the best insulation product in the world. Yeah. And now we're carefully removing it from everywhere that we find it. So that's true of a whole bunch of technologies, I think.
It is. I've got my father-in-law gave to me, I've got a set of encyclopedias right over where you are right now in my office. And they're from the late 1800s. And it is somewhat comical to think this is the breadth of knowledge that they had. And really smart people worked really hard to transfer that knowledge. Much of it, especially anything related to medicine, was just horribly, horribly wrong. But I want to talk a little bit about Calgary. And correct me if this is wrong, if this has changed recently, but in some ways is leading the way, especially North America, for this adaptive reuse and converting a lot of these buildings, a couple thousand units, a couple million square feet. I'm just curious about, can you give some context to the incentives that they're using or how the government is making it easy to build? Because I feel sometimes here in the 50 states here, we seem to be going the other way, where we're making it harder to do some things that would obviously be good for multiple parties. Yeah,
absolutely. So Calgary, as a bit of history, is basically an oil town, but had really struggled since the energy crisis in 2015. So going into COVID, they had about a 33% downtown vacancy.
Okay.
So they were, 20% worse than most cities across the US. What that meant was that when COVID started, they suddenly were like, well, it's not going to get better from here.
Right.
And it meant they had to act really quickly and really directly.
Okay.
And that's why they're ahead. They started with a bigger problem, but then they acted quickly. So what they said to us back in 2020 was, we want to take downtown, which has about 14 million square feet of vacancy, and we want to cut that vacancy in half. And we want to do that by producing housing. So it helped with the housing side and helped with the vibrancy of downtown, because empty offices don't have people in them, obviously. But it would also then help with their tax base, because empty buildings don't pay tax either. So getting people back in those buildings would mean the assessed value of the building goes up, and therefore the building starts paying tax again. So that was their three elements to their plan: create housing, remove office, up your tax revenue. So what we did was then take all of downtown, ran it through the algorithm, and went back to them and said, look, we think that of that 14 million square feet of vacancy, the market can probably get rid of about 3 million square feet by converting it. Those buildings work, they kind of make sense, that could go ahead. And they said, that's not enough. We need to get to 6 million square feet or 7 million square feet. We want to get half of that vacancy gone. And then it became this easy problem of like, okay, if the market can achieve this and the city wants to achieve that, there's a financial difference between the two. And that's what the incentive program needs to cover.
Okay.
And so that's what they built. That financial difference ended up being about $75 a square foot. That's what the city put forward as the incentive program. $75 Canadian, by the way, so you can do your own translation. But
Sure.
That's really what the difference was. And the city said, great, we're going to do it. And they kept it simple. They said, you can apply. If you own the building, you can apply for the incentive program. We will give you a letter that says that you've been accepted. You can take that to the bank and borrow the money. And then on completion of the project, on occupancy, we give you the cash. So it's not a tax abatement program or a tax credit or a, whatever. It is a simple incentive transaction. It's been highly successful because developers get it. Mm-hmm. It's very easy for them to bake it into their pro forma and say, mm-hmm. This is my construction cost minus $75 a square foot, because that's what the city's paying. Does the project make sense? So they now have 17 approved buildings in downtown. Some of them are completed already. But that's going to take out about 10% of their downtown office buildings, about 120 buildings in the city. They just reopened the program last week to accept new applications. There'll probably be 5 or 6 more projects that go through under the new application. But it's been incredibly successful. It's increased the amount of housing downtown by over 20%. It means that Calgary now has a declining vacancy rate. It's one of the only cities in North America where that's actually happening. So they started from a bad point, but it is going down. Other cities that we've looked at and worked with and other incentive programs have just taken that simple concept and made it too complicated. They've stacked TIF funding and tax abatement and historic tax credits and made the application processes difficult or time consuming. That's why you've not seen the uptake in other cities that you've seen in Calgary, because it's a good amount of money that makes a financial difference, and it's easy to understand, and the application process is quick. Mm-hmm. That's what you need. That's what they've done. Other cities, I think, are struggling to see that clarity. They've added too much politics onto it, honestly. Whereas there, it's a simple math equation, and I think that's what got support from city councillors, but also support from the public. Is it was easy to see that math. More people downtown, more housing. It's going to cost this much. Done.
Well, I think the math is easy. The story is easy. I think not only can the math travel, I should say, not only can the story travel, which is the most important thing. Someone's going to say, yeah, it seems risky though. What's the math? I don't know. I can do it on a bar napkin. Well, let's just walk it through right here. That little story there and why other municipalities and cities and politicians are struggling with it does not surprise me at all. There are so many lessons that are in there. I do want to ask you, and maybe just a little bit of a pivot here, the Gensler's workplace survey that they put out every year, I find fascinating for a number of different levels. The one is just how we are working, how that impacts office space, what it does to construction. But on top of that, I feel like we also get a little bit of the kind of the Gallup survey, you not only kind of combine why exactly do we come together to have meetings, to focus on work, to sit with my team, to socialize, but then it also ties in data that's really valuable about I understand how my work contributes to the company's mission. I have control over how I manage my work. My company cares about me, and really brings in kind of these different data sets that I find really valuable to me and I think to our clients. As this comes out, what stands out to you as we think about, and I'm not going to say the office of the future because it's not, it's the office of the present. What are the big insights that you'd say, hey, for everybody listening, as you're kind of thinking about whether it's back to work or you're on a job site or you're in a construction company where everyone physically has to come, but not everybody, what are the big, say, top 2 insights that you got out of that or you've been thinking about more that would be helpful to our audience?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of data in there, and breaking it down, the big factors are that the office needs to be the best place to work, and that means different things for different industries, as you'll see in the survey. But it's got to be the best place to do collaboration work, the best place to do heads down work, and it's got to be in the best location. It's got to be a desirable place to go to as well. Now, those factors mean different things for different industries and different people. So that means that you have to start designing in workplaces that are flexible, workplaces that are appropriately tailored for the people who are going to be working there. So there's not just a one size fits all approach, which I think the industry had started to move towards pre-COVID. It was like, how do we get more people in? How do you make the workplace efficient? And it had moved slightly away from how do you make it tailored to the people who are there. So as a kind of piece of the interiors of the office, that's become more and more important, and really is the only way of drawing people to actively want to be back. The other part of it, and the bit that I'm kind of really passionate about, is creating the areas where those office buildings are and making those desirable. And that's become super apparent. We have this term, earn the commute. Like, it's got to be worth going.
Yes.
And you start to see that in the way that we're working in some downtowns now, or the way we're designing office buildings, is that they are part of the neighborhood. They're no longer this kind of ivory tower standing alone, and you go in, you drive up, you park, you go in, you leave. They got to be part of that kind of 24/7 neighborhood. The office conversions we're doing help bring people to downtowns, so that's a big part of it. But then really reimagining how the office building sits in the city, how the ground floor works. It's not just a big kind of open lobby anymore. It's got to have services in there that you want to be near. You've got to have entertainment nearby, that kind of stuff. So it goes away now from just how do I design that corner office for the CEO, and goes into how do I design the office for the people and the tasks they're going to be doing, and then how do I design the building to make it desirable to come to, and then how do we change the neighborhood so it's a place people want to commute to. Mm-hmm. So it's added a lot of complexity to it. Honestly, it's a lot more difficult than it was pre-COVID to design the right kind of office and the right kind of office space. But this workplace survey we do, we publish that freely so everyone can see it, but we do that so that we have a deeper understanding of the kind of spaces people want, and then we can guide our designs accordingly. The other part that you said, which I think is super interesting, we used to talk about the office of the future because it used to be like, what do people want and how do we slowly transition to that? And it was always, the workplace survey was always a couple of years ahead of the trends. That's not the case anymore. You got to do it now. And a lot of the work we do with big companies is helping them take a pretty monumental leap from the office they had 5-6 years ago pre-COVID, or designed 10 years ago, to what they actually have to have now. And it's a process we help people through all the time, but it's a difficult process. It's not that office of the past anymore, and it is a big leap to where you need to be today.
Well, I'm sure you have this with the amount of time that you travel, whether you're visiting clients or you're visiting job sites. But when we visit clients and friends, there is that feeling when you come in and you think, that's awesome. You guys get to work here. I can imagine this is energizing. Yeah. You can feel it. There's an energy to it. And I'm sure you have experienced this one or more times. You walk in and I look around, I'm like, you guys got to come in here every day? I'm like, this is like, 1970s Soviet era block buildings, all concrete. And this conversation will come up and I'll say, how is it coming here? And they're like, well, I like the people, but
Yeah.
I don't want to be here. And I'm like, I don't blame you. The people are great. They're passionate about their customers, but just literally the environment where they're working, sunlight, fresh air, just what's around just sucks the life out of them. And I leave. I'm like, well, that's going to be a while, but that's not going to help them attract top talent and retain them. So
No, we see that when we go and do these conversion projects. I mean, obviously one of the things we do is actually go to the buildings and you walk around the office spaces, some that are there that still have tenants or some that are vacant. And you see that you walk in and it's, low ceiling, kind of dark.
mm-hmm.
Ground floor is just a little kind of weird lobby and elevator. And it's quite often, brown carpet, a sea of cubicles from the 70s. And you're like, it's no wonder this building's vacant. Like, it is not a nice place to work. So the majority of those are the ones we then are doing conversions on because they just aren't a good place to be. And that's been great for us from a business point of view to do these conversions and so on. A lot of these buildings can never be taken to the level that people now want. On top of that, we are walking the walk ourselves. We just finished our new San Francisco office, which I was able to visit a couple of months ago. And we did that. It's going to be a net zero project, but it's also exactly what the office of the now, as it were, is all about. It's in a great neighborhood. It's on the second floor, so you can walk up into it. And it has this kind of mixture of spaces. Starts with big, bright collaboration spaces at the front, gathering spaces. And as you go back through the office space away from the front entrance, the rooms start to become smaller and then more individual and then more guided towards kind of head down work. And what you find there is, and when I was working from there too, is that people really use it in that way. They'll come in the morning, they'll sit at the front, they'll chat to people, and then, okay, I need to go do this drawing, I need to go do this spreadsheet or this contract. I'm going to go to one of the individual focus rooms towards the back of the office where it's quieter and actually kind of a little darker as well. And I'm going to do that heads down work. And people will move 3 or 4 times during the day, depending on what their task is. And I think that's super interesting. And we tour a lot of clients through it, but it's super interesting to see it and be like, this is a great place to work. And if this isn't quite right for me, I'm going to go to that other space just across the hall, because that's exactly what I need right now. And people have got very used to that because they can tailor it a lot more easily in their own homes. So now they really need that in their office space.
Well, I think listening to you and also reading through the survey, I think part of what I lack is the vocabulary around this. When you say, well, this is a collaboration space versus a gathering space, I'm like, well, can I gather and collaborate? What this is doing, it'll give you a vocabulary to talk. And when you say heads down work, I know exactly what that means. That's not a phrase I've used, but it totally makes sense. So I think part of this is just giving a vocabulary to leaders and decision makers to say, okay, what makes most sense that can achieve all these goals? We're more productive. People are excited about coming. There's more energy in it. We can bring our customers through. We have some of our clients where I'll say, you ever bring your customers through? And they're like, God, no. We hope they don't even know what it looks like in here. They can drive by the front. We can't stop from doing that, but not in here. And now all of a sudden it's a marketing, it's a branding, it's a sales tool in addition to a great place to work.
Yeah. And it's the reality of your business. Think of it like, you as a person, you might have a persona that you want to project to the world, but if you invite people into your home, they get to really see what you're like.
Yeah.
And that's the same for your business. You've got to be able to have that space that embodies your brand and what you're trying to achieve as a company. And then you should be proud to bring your customers in, because they should walk in and be like, I get it. I understand exactly what this company's about. And it's difficult to achieve. But it is really important. It's good for your employees and good for your customers as well.
Yeah. I like that analogy of inviting them into your home. You're right. That's a totally different experience. And it's all about relationships, right? That intimacy and trust. Last question. I've kept you longer than I anticipated, but really enjoying learning from you, Stephen, here. Studied in Liverpool, live in Toronto, work with, I guess I should say Toronto. I say that second T a little bit too hard, don't I? Toronto.
Yeah, no one will know what you mean here if you say it like that.
Liverpool, Toronto, And obviously you work all in the United States and you travel here often. Anything you've learned or found interesting as you think about different cultures and behaviors that are common to general leadership styles that you might see in whether where you grew up or where you work now or in the States? Anything of interest as you think about just leadership very broadly, given kind of your cross-cultural career?
Yeah, I mean, there is a few culture shocks that you kind of see. I mean, the biggest one for me coming from the UK, and I worked for 10 years in Newcastle. We did a lot of design build. I spent a lot of time on construction sites, for 3 or 4 days a week while the projects were under construction. It is a much more blunt and aggressive culture in the UK.
Oh,
You will not get anything done in an architect's office or on a construction site, and unless you're yelling and swearing at someone. Coming to Canada in 2012, so 12 years ago,
yeah.
it was a real culture shock when people don't swear in the office and people are very kind of polite and organized on construction sites. And I was like, huh. So it took a bit of getting used to it. Also meant I upset a few people along the way, I think. The other big change, though, and this is something I have brought with me very actively, is that the UK and Europe was a long, long way ahead on the sustainability requirements and on the construction technology as well. So we were doing, all of the design build stuff did was what they called dry cold sites. So no wet trades, no site welding or site torching or anything like that. We were doing passive house quality buildings, highly insulated, airtight construction since the start of my career. So, 20 years. We were doing mass timber projects back then as well. In fact, one of the first projects I ever worked on was a hybrid mass timber project. I came here and it was a bit of a reset. It was probably 10 years behind at that point. So I've been able to bring some of that knowledge over. This is how you design it to be more sustainable. This is how you detail something to be like that. And then we've been bringing some of the trades and technology over as well. How do you really build a rain screen to make that efficient? How do you do more offsite assembly so that it is smoother on site? How do you cut down the number of weird, unique details and so on that require a lot more trade time and effort on site? And I think we're catching up on that now. That style of architecture that you'd see in Europe is now starting to infiltrate into the US and Canada with smaller window to wall ratios and different types of cladding, different types of way of insulating and approaching the kind of ethos of the building. Still got a way to go, but it's nice to see that really starting to happen now.
That's good. Well, grew up in kind of Chicago. My early part of my career was there, and now in Dallas. The words polite and organized, those don't immediately come to mind as adjectives I would use to broadly define my career. I do know Canada, though. Canada is different, but that is very interesting. That to me is non-obvious. I haven't spent a whole lot of time in the UK. Spent a little time in London, and I don't know. I felt like these people are just like Chicagoans with an accent, a little bit brusque, but not too. But that's interesting. I'm glad I asked.
I would say the north of England's a lot more like Chicago than it is like Canada. So.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you very much. I really appreciate you making time. Congrats on your success. And I think just all the thought leadership you are doing. For me, it kind of went down a rabbit hole where it started with the Fast Company article, and I reached out immediately. And then your willingness to make yourself available for podcasts and articles. There's a great one that we'll link to on mass timber. Yeah. And obviously this Gensler workplace survey you guys are doing is just, I think, extremely valuable for those that are going to make a little time to think about what we're doing and how we're getting work done. So thank you very much. I appreciate you making time.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks again for inviting me to be on. It's been great.
All right then, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my conversation with Mr. Stephen Paynter. He was very easy to talk to. I learned a lot from him. And if you are interested in the workplace survey that Gensler does every single year, I promise you, if you download that and read it, just understanding the data, both quantitative and qualitative, that they have collected from around the world about designing offices that help people do more of what they want to do the best they can at higher levels of productivity, I promise you there are insights that are in there. And if you did get value from this episode, please share it with your network. That means more to us than you know. And rate and review us on whatever podcast player you are listening to, as we are striving to grow our audience to bring everybody together so we can build more productively and profitably. That's all I've got. We're going to close out with our leadership mantra. You, my friend, are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.